The golden carriage rolled through the cobblestone streets of Valdoria's capital city, its wheels creating a rhythmic sound that echoed off the ancient stone buildings. Inside the luxurious compartment, 10-year-old Prince Alexander sat quietly by the window, watching the crowds of people who had gathered to catch a glimpse of the royal procession. His bright blue eyes sparkled with curiosity as he observed the colorful banners and cheering citizens lining the streets. Queen Regent Isabel sat across from the young prince, her emerald green gown spread elegantly around her. She had married King Edmund 2 years after the tragic death of his first wife, Queen Catherine, Alexander's beloved mother. The adjustment had been difficult for everyone in the palace, but particularly challenging for the sensitive young prince who still mourned his mother's passing. Captain Marcus Thornfield rode alongside the carriage on his powerful black stallion, his keen eyes constantly scanning the crowds for any signs of trouble. As the head of the royal guard, he had sworn an oath to protect the royal family with his life. His withered face bore the scars of many battles, and his reputation as a fearless warrior was known throughout the kingdom. But, beyond his duty as a guard, Marcus had developed a genuine affection for Prince Alexander, having watched the boy grow from a toddler into a thoughtful young man. The procession was returning from the annual harvest festival, where the royal family traditionally blessed the crops and celebrated with the common people. It was one of the most important traditions in Valdoria, dating back centuries. Prince Alexander had enjoyed the festivities, particularly the puppet shows and the traditional dances performed by the village children. His laughter had been infectious, and, for a brief moment, the palace staff had seen glimpses of the carefree child he used to be before his mother's death. As the carriage approached a narrow bridge that crossed the rushing river Astoria, Captain Thornfield noticed something troubling. Queen Regent Isabel's demeanor had changed dramatically. Her usual composed expression had twisted into something darker, and her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. He had served in the palace long enough to recognize the signs of her volatile temper, which had become increasingly unpredictable over the past months. The bridge was an ancient stone structure, barely wide enough for the royal carriage. On either side, the river rushed violently below, swollen from the recent autumn rains. The sound of the water crashing against the rocks created an ominous backdrop as the carriage wheels echoed hollowly across the stone bridge. Inside the carriage, tension was building. Prince Alexander had innocently mentioned how much he missed his mother during the festival, particularly when he saw other children with their mothers. The comment had struck a nerve with Queen Regent Isabel, who had always struggled with feelings of inadequacy compared to the beloved late queen. The people of Valdoria had adored Queen Catherine, and Isabel constantly felt as though she lived in her shadow. "Your mother," Isabel began, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "was not the saint everyone pretends she was." Her green eyes flashed dangerously as she leaned forward in her seat. Prince Alexander looked up in confusion, his young face showing hurt and bewilderment. "But, Mother was kind to everyone," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing water below. The Queen Regent's face contorted with anger. Years of resentment, jealousy, and frustration came boiling to the surface. She had tried to win the love and respect of the people, but they continued to whisper about the previous queen, comparing everything she did to the memory of the perfect Catherine. Even her own husband seemed distant, lost in memories of his first love. "Kind?" Isabel's voice rose to a shrill pitch. She was weak. The kingdom needs strength, not the pathetic softness she showed. Her hands began to shake with rage as she spoke. Captain Thornfield, riding close to the carriage window, heard the raised voices and immediately became alert. He had witnessed Queen Regent Isabel's temper tantrums before, usually directed at servants or court officials, but never had he heard her speak so harshly to the young prince. His instincts, honed by years of military service and palace intrigue, told him that something was very wrong. The carriage suddenly lurched as it hit a rough patch of stone on the ancient bridge. The movement caused Queen Regent Isabel to lose her balance momentarily, and, in that instant, her carefully maintained facade crumbled completely. All the pent-up anger, jealousy, and resentment that had been building for months exploded like a dam bursting. "You look just like her," she screamed at Prince Alexander, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the bridge. "Every day I have to see her face staring back at me through your eyes. Do you know what it's like to compete with a ghost?" Prince Alexander shrank back against the carriage wall, tears beginning to form in his eyes. He had never seen anyone, let alone a member of the royal family, behave with such frightening intensity. His small hands gripped the velvet cushions of his seat as he tried to make himself as small as possible. Outside, Captain Thornfield heard the Queen Regent screaming and immediately spurred his horse closer to the carriage. Through the small window, he could see the terrified expression on Prince Alexander's face and the wild, uncontrolled rage in Queen Regent Isabel's eyes. Every instinct he possessed as both a soldier and a protector told him that the situation was escalating beyond mere harsh words. The bridge seemed to amplify every sound, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. The rushing water below, the echo of the horses' hooves, the creaking of the carriage wheels, and the Queen Regent's increasingly hysterical voice all combined to create a symphony of chaos and danger. Inside the carriage, Queen Regent Isabel was completely lost to her rage. She began to reach toward Prince Alexander, her movements erratic and unpredictable. The young prince pressed himself further into the corner, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He couldn't understand why the woman who was supposed to be his new mother was treating him with such cruelty. Captain Thornfield made a split-second decision that would change everything. Drawing his sword with one hand while controlling his horse with the other, he called out in his commanding military voice, "Stop the carriage immediately!" The driver, recognizing the authority in his captain's tone and the urgency of the situation, pulled hard on the reins, bringing the ornate vehicle to an abrupt halt in the middle of the ancient bridge. The sudden stop threw both occupants of the carriage forward, temporarily breaking the spell of Queen Regent Isabel's rage. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rushing water below and the heavy breathing of everyone involved. But Captain Thornfield knew that this was only the beginning. As he dismounted his horse and approached the carriage door, he could see through the window that Queen Regent Isabel's rage was far from spent. Her eyes held a dangerous glint that he had seen before in the eyes of soldiers who had been pushed beyond their breaking point. The difference was that this time, her target was an innocent child who had done nothing more than mention his deceased mother with love and longing. The ancient bridge, which had stood for hundreds of years as a symbol of connection between the two sides of the kingdom, was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of loyalty, duty, and protection that held the royal guard together. Captain Thornfield placed his hand on the ornate handle of the carriage door, knowing that whatever happened next would define not only his career but, potentially, the future of the entire kingdom. As he prepared to open the door, the sound of Queen Regent Isabel's voice rose once again from within the carriage, and, this time, her words carried a threat that made the seasoned warrior's blood run cold. Captain Thornfield's weathered hand hesitated for just a moment on the carriage door handle as Queen Regent Isabel's voice reached a terrifying crescendo from within. "Perhaps it would be better if you joined your precious mother," she hissed at Prince Alexander, her words dripping with malice that sent chills down the spine of every guard present. The young prince's sob was clearly audible through the ornate walls of the carriage, a sound so heartbreaking that it galvanized the captain into immediate action. With one swift motion, he yanked open the heavy door, his powerful frame filling the doorway like an avenging angel. His steel-gray eyes took in the scene instantly, Prince Alexander cowering in the far corner, tears streaming down his pale cheeks, while Queen Regent Isabel loomed over him with her hands raised in what could only be described as a threatening manner. "Your Majesty," Captain Thornfield said, his voice carrying the controlled authority of a man who had commanded troops in battle, "I must ask you to step away from the prince immediately." Queen Regent Isabel whirled around to face him, her carefully arranged hair now disheveled and her emerald eyes blazing with unbridled fury. "How dare you interrupt me?" she shrieked, spittle flying from her lips. "I am the Queen Regent of Valdoria. You forget your place, Captain." But Marcus Thornfield had not forgotten his place at all. His place was exactly where he stood, between danger and the innocent child he had sworn to protect. His oath to the crown included protecting all members of the royal family, but when those very members threatened each other, his duty became crystal clear. Protect the innocent, defend the defenseless, preserve the future of the kingdom. "My place," he said quietly, stepping into the carriage despite its cramped confines, "is protecting Prince Alexander. And, right now, Your Majesty, you are the threat I must protect him from." The words hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Never in the history of Valdoria had a member of the royal guard directly confronted a reigning monarch or regent with such boldness. The other guards, who had gathered around the carriage upon hearing the commotion, exchanged uncertain glances. Their loyalty was torn between their current ruler and their captain, a man they respected and trusted with their lives. Queen Regent Isabel's face turned an alarming shade of purple as the full implications of the captain's words sank in. "Treason," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "This is treason. I'll have you executed. I'll have your entire family stripped of their lands and titles." But her threats fell on deaf ears. Captain Thornfield had faced charging cavalry, siege weapons, and assassins in dark alleys. The rage of one unstable woman, even if she wore a crown, did not frighten him. What did concern him was the safety of the child who had pressed himself so far into the corner that he seemed to be trying to disappear entirely. "Prince Alexander," the captain said gently, extending his hand toward the boy while never taking his eyes off Queen Regent Isabel, "come to me. You're safe now." The young prince looked between the two adults with confusion and terror. He had been taught from birth to respect and obey his elders, especially members of the royal family. But he had also been taught to trust Captain Thornfield, who had been a constant, reassuring presence in his life since his mother's death. The gentle giant who told him stories of brave knights and helped him practice his swordsmanship was offering sanctuary, while the woman who was supposed to be his new mother was looking at him with eyes that promised nothing but pain. "Don't you dare move, you little brat." Queen Regent Isabel snarled at the prince, lunging forward in an attempt to grab his arm. "I'm not finished with you yet." That was the moment Captain Thornfield's military training took over completely. In one fluid motion, he stepped between Queen Regent Isabel and Prince Alexander, using his considerable bulk to shield the child from her grasp. At the same time, he caught her wrist in an iron grip, stopping her advance cold. "I said step away from the prince," he repeated, his voice now carrying the deadly calm of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. The physical contact between a commoner and royalty, even in the context of protection, was another unprecedented breach of protocol. Queen Regent Isabel stared at her captured wrist in shock, as if she couldn't believe that someone had actually dared to lay hands on her person. Outside the carriage, the tension among the other guards was palpable. Sir Edmund Blackwood, the youngest member of the Royal Guard, shifted nervously in his saddle. He had joined the Guard only 6 months earlier, full of romantic ideals about serving the crown and protecting noble causes. Nothing in his training had prepared him for a situation where he might have to choose between different members of the royal family. Lieutenant James Morrison, a grizzled veteran who had served alongside Captain Thornfield for over a decade, made his choice without hesitation. He dismounted his horse and positioned himself at the carriage door, ready to support his captain whatever the cost. His loyalty was not to a crown or a title, but to the man who had saved his life countless times and to the principles of honor and protection that the Guard was supposed to represent. "Release me this instant," Queen Regent Isabel commanded, struggling against the captain's grip. But her struggles were futile against his strength, earned through years of swordplay and military exercises. "I will release you when you give me your word that you will not harm Prince Alexander," Captain Thornfield replied steadily. "As Queen Regent, your word should be your bond." The challenge implicit in his statement was clear: prove that you are worthy of the crown you wear. Show that you can control yourself and act with the dignity and honor expected of royalty. The captain was essentially giving her an opportunity to salvage both the situation and her reputation, but only if she could overcome her rage long enough to think clearly. For a moment, it seemed as though reason might prevail. Queen Regent Isabel's struggles ceased, and her breathing began to slow. The wild look in her eyes flickered, as if she was fighting an internal battle between her fury and her awareness of the gravity of the situation. But then, Prince Alexander, in his childish innocence, made a small sound of relief, thinking the confrontation was over. That tiny sound seemed to reignite all of Queen Regent Isabel's rage like oil thrown on a fire. "You think this is over," she hissed, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was somehow more frightening than her earlier screaming. "You have no idea what you've started, Captain. No idea at all." Captain Thornfield felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear for himself, but from the realization that Queen Regent Isabel's hatred for Prince Alexander ran much deeper than a simple moment of anger. This was not a temporary loss of control brought on by stress or frustration. This was something darker, more calculated, and infinitely more dangerous. The ancient bridge beneath them seemed to creak ominously in the wind, as if the very stones could sense the momentous nature of what was transpiring. The sound of the rushing water below grew louder, creating an almost hypnotic backdrop to the deadly serious drama unfolding in the confines of the royal carriage. Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat from the doorway. "Captain," he said carefully, "the sun is beginning to set. We should consider returning to the palace before darkness falls." It was a tactful way of pointing out that they could not remain on the bridge indefinitely. Whatever was going to happen needed to be resolved quickly, before word of the confrontation spread beyond the small group of guards who were present. The political implications of the situation were staggering, and every moment they delayed increased the risk of a scandal that could destabilize the entire kingdom. Captain Thornfield nodded slightly, acknowledging his lieutenant's concern while never taking his attention off Queen Regent Isabel. The woman's eyes had taken on a calculating look that he found even more disturbing than her earlier rage. She was planning something, and he had the terrible suspicion that whatever it was would put Prince Alexander in even greater danger than before. The calculating gleam in Queen Regent Isabel's eyes sent warning signals through every fiber of Captain Thornfield's being. In his 20 years of military service, he had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, and what he saw in her expression made his blood run cold. This was no longer about anger or jealousy, this was about something far more sinister. "Very well, Captain," she said with an unnaturally sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes, "you have made your position quite clear. But, you seem to forget something very important." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing with venom dripping from every syllable. "I am not just Queen Regent. I am also Prince Alexander's legal guardian. And, as his guardian, I have every right to discipline him as I see fit." The legal technicality hit Captain Thornfield like a physical blow. She was absolutely correct. According to Valdorian law, as the prince's stepmother and the current regent, Queen Isabel had complete authority over the child until he came of age. The captain's intervention, while morally justified, had no legal foundation. He had essentially committed an act of treason by physically restraining the regent. Prince Alexander, still huddled in the corner of the carriage, seemed to understand the implications even through his fear. His large blue eyes darted between the two adults, and fresh tears began to flow down his cheeks. The weight of his helplessness was crushing, and the realization that even Captain Thornfield, his protector and friend, might not be able to save him from his stepmother's wrath was almost too much for his young mind to bear. However, Queen Regent Isabel continued, her voice now taking on a tone of false reasonableness, "I am not an unreasonable woman. I am willing to overlook this misunderstanding if certain conditions are met." Captain Thornfield remained silent, but his grip on her wrist tightened slightly. He knew a trap when he heard one, and every instinct told him that whatever condition she was about to propose would be worse than the current situation. "First," she said, counting on her fingers with her free hand, "you will release me immediately and offer a formal apology for laying hands on your sovereign. Second, you will return to the palace and submit yourself for disciplinary action. Third," here her voice dropped to a whisper that only he could hear, "you will never interfere in my relationship with Prince Alexander again. Not ever." The third condition was the real demand, and they both knew it. She was essentially asking him to abandon his duty to protect the prince in exchange for avoiding immediate charges of treason. It was a devil's bargain, and the calculating look in her eyes told him that she knew exactly how impossible his position had become. Outside the carriage, Lieutenant Morrison was growing increasingly anxious. The other guards were beginning to whisper among themselves, and he could see curious faces appearing at windows in the distant buildings. Word of the strange halt on the bridge was beginning to spread, and soon they would have an audience that would make any resolution of the situation infinitely more complicated. "Captain," he called softly, "we have company approaching from the east." Captain Thornfield glanced quickly through the carriage window and saw what his lieutenant meant. A small group of mounted courtiers, probably returning from their own excursions to the festival, were approaching the bridge. Among them, he recognized the distinctive purple robes of Lord Chancellor Aldrich, one of Queen Regent Isabel's most trusted advisors and a man known for his ruthless ambition. The sight of Lord Chancellor Aldrich approaching filled the captain with dread. If the situation wasn't resolved before the Chancellor arrived, it would become a matter of public record, subject to formal investigation and court proceedings. The captain's actions would be scrutinized by a tribunal that was heavily influenced by Queen Regent Isabel's supporters, and the outcome would almost certainly be his execution for treason. But, even worse than the threat to his own life was the realization that once the incident became public knowledge, Prince Alexander would be completely at Queen Regent Isabel's mercy. There would be no one left to protect him, and her earlier threat about the boy joining his mother took on an even more sinister meaning. "Choose quickly, Captain," Queen Regent Isabel said, having noticed the approaching courtiers as well. "Lord Chancellor Aldrich is a stickler for proper protocol. I doubt he would be as understanding of your protective instincts as I am being." The trap was closing around them, and Captain Thornfield found himself facing an impossible choice. Accept her conditions and abandon Prince Alexander to whatever fate she had planned, or maintain his stand and face certain execution while still leaving the boy unprotected. But, as he looked down at Prince Alexander's tear-stained face, something inside the grizzled warrior hardened into resolve. The boy reminded him so much of his own son, who had died of fever 3 years earlier. The same intelligent eyes, the same sensitive nature, the same trust in the adults around him to keep him safe. Captain Thornfield had failed to protect his own child from disease, but he would not fail to protect this one from evil. "I have a counter-proposal, Your Majesty," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality that made Queen Regent Isabel's eyes narrow with suspicion. "You are hardly in a position to make demands, Captain," she replied coldly. "Perhaps not," he acknowledged, "but I am in a position to make observations. And I observe that Lord Chancellor Aldrich is not alone. Do you see the man in the blue cloak riding beside him?" Queen Regent Isabel turned to look, and her face went pale as she recognized the figure. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the kingdom's most respected magistrate and a man known for his unwavering integrity, was indeed among the approaching group. Sir Geoffrey served alongside the late king during the border wars, Captain Thornfield continued conversationally, though his grip on her wrist never relaxed. He was also present at Prince Alexander's christening, where he swore a personal oath to Queen Catherine to always watch over her son's welfare. "I wonder what he would make of your disciplinary methods, if he were to witness them firsthand." The color drained completely from Queen Regent Isabel's face as the full implications of his words sank in. Sir Geoffrey's reputation for honesty was legendary, and his personal connection to the late Queen made him one of the few men in the kingdom who could challenge her authority when it came to Prince Alexander's welfare. If he witnessed her behavior toward the child, he would be duty-bound to report it to King Edmund, regardless of the political consequences. Furthermore, the captain continued, pressing his advantage, "I notice that young Sir Edmund Blackwood has been taking notes throughout this entire encounter. As the newest member of the Guard, he is still in the habit of documenting everything for his training reports. I'm sure his detailed account of today's events would make for fascinating reading." Indeed, Sir Edmund had been nervously scribbling in his leather-bound journal, a habit drilled into him by his instructors at the Royal Military Academy. His face went crimson as he realized that his innocent note-taking had suddenly become a crucial element in the standoff. Queen Regent Isabel's breathing became rapid and shallow as she realized that her position was not as strong as she had initially believed. The approaching witnesses would make it impossible for her to simply dismiss the captain's actions as insubordination. She would be forced to explain why a decorated war hero had felt compelled to physically restrain her to protect Prince Alexander. What do you want?" she asked through gritted teeth, the false sweetness completely gone from her voice. "I want your solemn oath, given before witnesses, that you will never again raise your hand or voice to Prince Alexander in anger," Captain Thornfield replied without hesitation. "I want your promise that any future discipline will be conducted with at least 2 neutral witnesses present. And I want your guarantee that the prince will have unrestricted access to me or Lieutenant Morrison whenever he feels unsafe." The terms were harsh, essentially placing Queen Regent Isabel under constant scrutiny when it came to her interactions with her stepson. But they were also reasonable, designed to protect the child without completely undermining her authority as regent. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Queen Regent Isabel could see that she was rapidly running out of time to make a decision. Lord Chancellor Aldrich and Sir Geoffrey were close enough now that their voices could be heard calling out greetings to the guards. Prince Alexander, who had been listening to the entire exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up in his small, clear voice. "Please," he whispered, looking directly at his stepmother, "I just want to go home. I promise I'll be good. I won't talk about Mama anymore if it makes you sad." The innocent plea from the child she had been threatening seemed to strike Queen Regent Isabel like a physical blow. For just a moment, the mask of rage and calculation slipped, and something almost human flickered in her eyes. But it was gone so quickly that Captain Thornfield wondered if he had imagined it. The moment of humanity that had flickered in Queen Regent Isabel's eyes vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a cold, calculating expression that chilled Captain Thornfield to his very soul. Prince Alexander's innocent plea seemed to have the opposite effect of what the child had hoped for, hardening her resolve rather than softening her heart. "How touching," she said with bitter sarcasm, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying enough venom to poison a dragon. "The little prince thinks he can manipulate me with his sweet words and crocodile tears, just like his precious mother used to do with his father." The approaching hoofbeats were now close enough that individual voices could be distinguished. Lord Chancellor Aldrich was discussing trade negotiations with Sir Geoffrey, their conversation providing an oddly normal backdrop to the life and death drama unfolding in the royal carriage. Captain Thornfield realized that time had run out for negotiation. Within moments, the courtiers would reach the bridge and witness whatever happened next. He had to make a choice that would affect not only his own fate but the future safety of Prince Alexander and possibly the stability of the entire kingdom. "Your Majesty," he said firmly, making his decision, "I am going to release your wrist now, and we are going to step out of this carriage together. You will smile and greet Lord Chancellor Aldrich and Sir Geoffrey as if nothing unusual has happened. We will return to the palace, and this evening you will give me your oath in front of witnesses, or I will request an immediate audience with King Edmund to discuss the welfare of his son." Queen Regent Isabel's eyes blazed with fury, but she nodded curtly. She understood that she had no choice but to play along, at least until they reached the palace where she would have home advantage and could control the narrative more effectively. Captain Thornfield slowly released her wrist, ready to grab her again if she made any sudden moves toward Prince Alexander. "Prince Alexander," he said gently, "take my hand and stay close to me." The young prince scrambled across the carriage seat and grasped the captain's large, calloused hand with both of his small ones. The contact seemed to give him strength, and his tears began to slow as he felt the reassuring presence of his protector. As they stepped out of the carriage, Captain Thornfield positioned himself so that he was always between Queen Regent Isabel and Prince Alexander. To any casual observer, it might have looked like he was simply being respectful by allowing the regent to exit first, but his true purpose was to maintain his protective barrier. "Lord Chancellor! Sir Geoffrey!" Queen Regent Isabel called out with a brightness that seemed almost convincing. "What a pleasant surprise to encounter you on the road. I trust you enjoyed the festival as much as we did?" Lord Chancellor Aldrich, a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes, bowed formally from his saddle. "Indeed, Your Majesty. The harvest celebrations were particularly splendid this year. I trust young Prince Alexander was suitably impressed by the traditional ceremonies?" Before Queen Regent Isabel could respond, Sir Geoffrey had dismounted and was approaching Prince Alexander with a warm smile. The old knight had a genuine affection for the boy, stemming from his friendship with Queen Catherine and his own role as a grandfather to several children. "Prince Alexander," Sir Geoffrey said kindly, kneeling to the boy's level, "you look pale, lad. Are you feeling well? The excitement of the festival can be quite overwhelming for young minds." Prince Alexander looked up at Captain Thornfield uncertainly, clearly unsure of how much he should say. The captain gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, understanding that the boy needed to make his own choice about what to reveal. I'm a little tired, Sir Geoffrey," Prince Alexander said carefully, his voice still shaky from his earlier ordeal. The carriage ride was eventful. Sir Geoffrey's experienced eyes immediately picked up on the tension in the boy's voice and the protective way Captain Thornfield was standing. As a veteran of court politics and military campaigns, he had developed an instinct for detecting trouble, and everything about this scene set off warning bells in his mind. "Eventful, you say?" Sir Geoffrey mused, his gaze shifting between Queen Regent Isabel's too bright smile and Captain Thornfield's rigid posture. I do hope it was the good kind of eventful. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been watching the exchange with growing anxiety, decided to provide some subtle support for his captain. Sir Geoffrey, he interjected respectfully, Prince Alexander has been asking many thoughtful questions about his mother today. It's clear that Queen Catherine's memory remains very much alive in his heart. The comment was perfectly innocent on the surface, but it served to explain the boy's emotional state while also subtly reminding everyone present of Queen Catherine's beloved status and her connection to Prince Alexander. It was a masterful piece of diplomatic maneuvering that made Captain Thornfield proud of his second-in-command. Queen Regent Isabel's smile became even more strained at the mention of her predecessor, but she managed to maintain her composure. Yes, she said through gritted teeth, Alexander is very devoted to his mother's memory. Sometimes perhaps too devoted, but that's understandable for a child his age. The slight emphasis she placed on too devoted was not lost on Sir Geoffrey, whose eyebrows rose slightly. He had served in the royal court long enough to read between the lines of such carefully chosen words. Devotion to one's parents is never excessive, Sir Geoffrey said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. It is one of the highest virtues a child can possess, and one that should be encouraged and nurtured by all who care for him. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Queen Regent Isabel's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She opened her mouth to respond, but Lord Chancellor Aldrich chose that moment to interject with a comment about the lateness of the hour and the need to return to the palace before full darkness fell. As the group began to reorganize for the journey back to the palace, Captain Thornfield found himself walking alongside Sir Geoffrey while Prince Alexander rode in a different carriage, one that the magistrate had tactfully suggested might be more comfortable for the tired child. Marcus, Sir Geoffrey said quietly, using the captain's first name in the familiar way of old soldiers, is there something I should know about what happened on that bridge? Captain Thornfield wrestled with his conscience for a moment. His duty to the crown required discretion, but his oath to protect Prince Alexander demanded honesty. In the end, his decision was made by a simple question: what would Queen Catherine have wanted him to do? Sir Geoffrey, he said carefully, I believe Prince Alexander would benefit from having more neutral observers present during his interactions with Queen Regent Isabel. His grief over his mother's death sometimes creates tensions that might be better managed with additional support. It was a diplomatically phrased way of saying that Queen Regent Isabel was dangerous to the child, and Sir Geoffrey understood immediately. His expression grew grim as he processed the implications. I see, he said slowly. And you believe these tensions might escalate without proper oversight? I believe, Captain Thornfield replied with careful precision, that Prince Alexander's safety and well-being must remain our highest priority, regardless of any other considerations. Sir Geoffrey nodded thoughtfully. As one of the kingdom's most senior legal minds, he understood exactly what the captain was telling him and why he was being so careful with his words. The situation was politically explosive, but the safety of the heir to the throne took precedence over all other concerns. Behind them, Queen Regent Isabel rode in stony silence, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond her expectations. The presence of Sir Geoffrey complicated everything, as did the obvious loyalty that the guards showed to Captain Thornfield rather than to her. As the royal procession finally left the ancient bridge and began the final approach to the palace, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed almost prophetic. Change was coming to the kingdom of Valdoria, whether Queen Regent Isabel wanted it or not. Prince Alexander, safely ensconced in Sir Geoffrey's carriage, had fallen into an exhausted sleep against the old knight's shoulder. In his dreams, he was once again a small child being held by his mother, her gentle voice singing the lullabies that had always made him feel safe and loved. But, even in sleep, his small hand remained clenched around a small token that Captain Thornfield had quietly pressed into his palm before they changed carriages, a silver medallion bearing the crest of the Royal Guard and the motto, protection above all. It was a promise that whatever darkness lay ahead, he would not face it alone. The massive gates of Valdoria Palace loomed ahead as the royal procession approached through the gathering dusk. The ancient fortress, built of dark stone and crowned with soaring towers, had stood for over 5 centuries as a symbol of the kingdom's strength and continuity. Tonight, however, its imposing walls would witness events that would forever change the course of the royal lineage. Captain Thornfield rode at the head of the guard formation, his mind working furiously to plan the next few crucial hours. He knew that Queen Regent Isabel would not simply accept defeat gracefully. Once they were within the palace walls, she would have access to her network of supporters, loyal servants, and political allies who could help her craft a narrative that painted him as a treasonous guard who had overstepped his bounds. Sir Geoffrey's carriage, carrying the sleeping Prince Alexander, rolled smoothly through the cobblestone courtyard as servants rushed forward with torches to light the way. The old magistrate had spent the journey back to the palace in deep thought, considering the legal and political implications of what Captain Thornfield had carefully not told him. His years of experience in royal law told him that a storm was brewing, one that could potentially tear the kingdom apart. As the procession came to a halt in the main courtyard, Queen Regent Isabel stepped down from her carriage with regal composure, though those who knew her well could see the fury simmering just beneath the surface. She immediately began issuing orders to the assembled servants and courtiers, reasserting her authority through the familiar rhythms of palace protocol. "Lord Chancellor Aldrich," she called imperiously, "I require an immediate meeting with the Privy Council. There are matters of urgent importance that must be addressed this evening." Lord Chancellor Aldrich bowed obsequiously, but his sharp eyes had already taken note of the unusual tensions within the group. As a master of court intrigue, he could sense undercurrents of conflict even when he didn't understand their exact nature. "Of course, Your Majesty," he replied smoothly. "Shall I also summon the Master of Arms and the Chief Justice?" If there are matters of security or law to be discussed, their presence might prove valuable. The suggestion was subtly worded, but its implications were clear. Lord Chancellor Aldrich had noticed something amiss and was positioning himself to be present for whatever revelation was coming. Queen Regent Isabel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she realized that the Chancellor's political instincts had detected the brewing crisis. Meanwhile, Sir Geoffrey had gently awakened Prince Alexander and was helping the drowsy child from the carriage. The old knight's paternal instincts had been fully activated, and he had no intention of allowing the boy out of his sight until he was certain of his safety. "Come along, young prince," Sir Geoffrey said kindly, taking the child's hand. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. I believe Cook mentioned something about preparing your favorite honey cakes for dinner." Prince Alexander managed a small smile at the mention of honey cakes, but his eyes immediately sought out Captain Thornfield, needing the reassurance of his protector's presence. The captain caught the boy's gaze and gave him a subtle nod, a silent promise that he would not be abandoned. As the various members of the party began to disperse toward their respective duties and quarters, Queen Regent Isabel made her move. With a voice that carried clearly across the courtyard, she called out, "Captain Thornfield, you will report to the council chamber immediately. Your conduct this evening requires immediate review and correction." The words were chosen carefully, designed to sound like a routine disciplinary matter to any casual observers while simultaneously putting the captain on notice that his actions would be scrutinized by a tribunal that she controlled. It was a masterful piece of political theater, but Captain Thornfield had been expecting exactly this maneuver. "Of course, Your Majesty," he replied formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "However, I believe Sir Geoffrey wished to speak with me first regarding Prince Alexander's security arrangements for this evening. Given the child's emotional state after today's events, extra precautions may be warranted." The captain's response was equally theatrical, establishing that Prince Alexander's welfare was the primary concern while also ensuring that Sir Geoffrey would be involved in whatever came next. By mentioning the boy's emotional state, he was also laying the groundwork for questions about what had caused that distress. Sir Geoffrey, understanding his cue perfectly, stepped forward with magisterial authority. "Indeed, Captain. Prince Alexander's well-being must be our first priority. Your Majesty, with your permission, I would like to review the security protocols for the prince's quarters. Recent events have made me somewhat concerned about potential vulnerabilities." The phrase "recent events" hung in the air like a sword poised to fall. Queen Regent Isabel's face went pale as she realized that Sir Geoffrey was not simply going to stand aside and allow her to control the narrative. The magistrate's reputation for integrity meant that his concerns would be taken seriously by anyone who heard them. "Recent events?" Lord Chancellor Aldrich inquired, his political instincts fully alert now. "Has something occurred that affects the security of the royal family?" If so, the Privy Council must be informed immediately. The web of implications was spreading rapidly, and Queen Regent Isabel could see her carefully laid plans unraveling before her eyes. She had hoped to isolate Captain Thornfield and deal with him quietly, but instead found herself facing a growing coalition of witnesses and officials who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been watching the exchanges with growing confidence, chose that moment to add his own subtle contribution. "Sir Geoffrey, if I may suggest, young Sir Edmund Blackwood has maintained detailed records of this evening's patrol activities. His documentation might prove useful in reviewing our security procedures." Sir Edmund, still clutching his leather journal, straightened his shoulders with pride at being mentioned, completely unaware that his innocent note-taking had become a crucial weapon in the battle for Prince Alexander's safety. His detailed account of the confrontation on the bridge would provide irrefutable evidence of what had transpired. Queen Regent Isabel looked around the courtyard and realized that she was rapidly becoming outnumbered. Captain Thornfield, Sir Geoffrey, Lieutenant Morrison, and even young Sir Edmund were all aligned against her, while Lord Chancellor Aldrich was positioning himself to be on whichever side emerged victorious. But she was not without resources of her own. Queen Regent Isabel had not survived the treacherous waters of court politics by giving up easily. If she could not control the immediate situation, she could at least ensure that any investigation would take place on her terms. "Very well," she said with icy dignity, "if there are concerns about security protocols, then let us address them properly. Lord Chancellor, I am calling for a formal inquiry into the events of this evening. All relevant parties will provide sworn testimony, and we will get to the bottom of whatever has caused this confusion." A formal inquiry was a double-edged sword. It would provide a platform for Captain Thornfield and the others to present their evidence, but it would also allow Queen Regent Isabel to call her own witnesses and challenge the credibility of her accusers. Moreover, as the regent, she would have significant influence over the composition and procedures of any investigative body. Captain Thornfield recognized the trap being set, but he also knew that a formal inquiry was better than the alternative of being quietly removed from his position and possibly executed for treason. At least in an open forum, Prince Alexander's welfare would be a matter of public record. "I welcome such an inquiry, Your Majesty," he said formally. "I have nothing to hide regarding my actions in defense of Prince Alexander's safety and well-being." The gauntlet had been thrown down on both sides. As the various parties began to move toward their respective preparations for the coming legal battle, Prince Alexander tugged gently on Sir Geoffrey's hand. "Sir Geoffrey," the boy said in his small, clear voice, "am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong?" The old knight knelt down to the child's level, his weathered face softening with compassion. "No, young prince. You have done nothing wrong. Sometimes adults have disagreements about what's best, but you are not to blame for any of it." "Will Captain Thornfield be all right?" Prince Alexander asked, his eyes wide with worry. "He was only trying to help me." Sir Geoffrey's expression grew grim as he considered how to answer the child's question honestly while still providing reassurance. "Captain Thornfield is a good man who was doing his duty," he said finally. "And, sometimes, doing one's duty requires courage, even when it's difficult or dangerous." As Prince Alexander was led away to his quarters under Sir Geoffrey's protective escort, the battle lines for the coming conflict were clearly drawn. On one side stood Queen Regent Isabel, with her royal authority, political connections, and ruthless determination to maintain her position. On the other side stood Captain Thornfield, with his military honor, loyal subordinates, and unwavering commitment to protecting an innocent child. The ancient stones of Valdoria Palace had witnessed many conflicts over the centuries, but few had carried such profound implications for the future of the kingdom. As the great bell tower chimed the evening hour, all parties began their preparations for a confrontation that would determine not only their individual fates, but the very soul of the monarchy itself. In his quarters, Prince Alexander clutched Captain Thornfield's medallion tightly as Sir Geoffrey told him stories of brave knights and noble quests, trying to ease the child's mind before sleep. Outside his window, the lights of the palace burned late into the night as testimonies were prepared, witnesses were interviewed, and the wheels of justice began their inexorable turn. The future of Valdoria hung in the balance, suspended between the forces of corruption and integrity, cruelty and compassion, power and protection. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shake the kingdom to its foundations, but, tonight, at least, one innocent child slept safely under the watchful guard of those who had sworn to protect him, no matter the cost to themselves.